We're going to start out by creating a new document, a file new, and we want to use, let's do a 2000 by 2000 pixel image. And the reason we're going so high is because it's a lot easier to downgrade than it is to make our materials larger. And we want to make sure that we have as much detail as we need. And if we're going to be working on these, we might as well do it full res, and then we can scale it down later if we need to. Especially if you want to decrease render times within View, then you'll want to have smaller image maps. But we're going to start out 2000 by 2000 and click OK. And now I'm just going to go to our Layers panel, and I want to turn this to Small Thumbnails so that we can see all of our different layers that we're going to have, because we're going to be creating several dozen different layers with all of our different leaves. And the first thing we want to work on is our initial branches. So I'm going to go to our Layer panel and just create a new layer. And I can name this Branches and click OK. And now what we're going to be doing is using the paintbrush tool to just paint in some basic branches and the overall shape of our tree. And we want to make sure we set our color to black, and you'll see why a little bit later, but we're just going to be building all of our branches and just drawing those out with a black brush. And I'm just going to right mouse click and change our diameter. And we also want to make sure we're just using a basic brush. We want something with a hardness of 100% because we don't want any gradient type edges and no fading. We want as sharp of an edge as we can possibly get. Of course, we will be refining that a little bit later as well. So we're going to take a look at our diameter. And now if you're using a pressure sensitive tablet, then you've got a little bit of an advantage. And since I am currently using one, I just want to make sure our diameter is a little bit higher. And that way we can adjust those amounts as needed. So what I'm going to do is just draw out a couple of branches. And now depending on the thickness of these is really more of a preference, and also depending on which type of tree you're editing. And I'm just going to draw out another one. And of course we'll be editing this. This is just a sort of a rough sketch. And I'm going to bring down our diameter just a little bit now and start making some branches coming off of the sides here. And just a couple here and there. And I'm going to add more one on the side. A little bit of a smaller one coming off here. And we don't have to worry about these extra little edges here because we can always delete those. It's not really a big deal. So I'm just going to go and finish this up really quick and get all our branches in order. Okay, so now we have just our very basic branches laid out. And one thing I want to do, just to add a little bit of realism, is we want to go in with our black brush again, making sure we're still in that same layer. And we're just going to connect certain areas to make it look a little more realistic. And we just want to draw out these bottom parts to give it a nice blend to where our different branches split apart. We just want to add that to all those little sections, just so it looks a little more realistic. In most cases, a lot of these you won't really see all that much, just because our material, in relation to the size of the tree and how many of these are going to be copied, really isn't that high. Another thing we want to make sure we do, delete some of these thicker branches if we want to stay consistent with the realism. So I'm just going to thin this one out just a little. And we'll zoom back out and take a look. And overall, this should work fairly well. Another thing we want to keep in mind too is that we want to make our branches a little tiny bit thicker than they're actually going to look. And the reason for that is our clip maps that we're creating, we need to expand those just a little bit beyond these edges. So if you look at it in printing terms, we're creating a full bleed. So we're just going a little bit larger than we normally would, because we can see these are actually some rather thick branches, and normally we'd have something a little bit thinner. And of course, the level of detail you choose to create is entirely up to you. You could add a lot more smaller branches in there if you wanted, little bits here and there. If you wanted to just add some smaller stuff coming off the sides, we could easily do that. Just to add that tiny little bit of extra realism in there. We'll just make a couple. Not really too concerned about looks at this point. Okay, and now we want to, of course, make this look like bark. So what we're going to be using is a texture map. And in this case, I'm going to be using bark texture from the AZLFX Seamless Bark Collection, and more specifically, bark number 69. And I'm just going to drag this layer onto our branches that we have. And then we want to move this around so that it fits over all of our branches. And since these are seamless, we can just double them up, and we don't have to worry about any lines showing up from seams. I'm also going to turn on snap, and then we're just going to copy this layer by dragging it down to the bottom here. And I'm going to move that over, and that should snap into place on the old one. And then I can merge these down by hitting Control E, so now they're both on the same layer. And then I'm going to create another copy, and we can just butt it up to that bottom part. And if you need to constrain the axis, you can of course do that by holding down Shift. So I'm going to undo, hold down Shift, and we can just move it down till it snaps in place. And once it's snapped, we can merge that down once again, Control E. And now we have all this texture on one specific layer. And if you want a little more detail, what you can actually do is just scale this image map down a little bit. If you want to have maybe a tighter bit of bark on there. And of course, depending on the type of bark texture that you're using, if you're even using a bark texture, can of course play a huge role. But one thing we want to do now is use this existing shape that we have and cut that out of our bark layer, so we're just working with our texture. So I'm going to use the magic wand tool, and we're going to take a look, and our tolerance at 10 should be fine. And I'm just going to click in our white area, and that's going to select everything except the actual branches that we created. So now we're going to move and turn back on our layer for our bark, and we can just hit delete. And after we hit delete, we're just left with our little bit of bark here. And I can turn off our black branches that we created and deselect this area. And now we want to create the illusion of depth around the edges of this material. So we can do this actually quite easily. And I'm going to double click on our layer 1, which is our new branches. And we're going to select inner shadow. And what this is going to do is create a shadow along the edges of the entire object, and that way it gives us the illusion of depth. And I'm going to make sure our inner shadow is up to 100% opacity just for right now, and our distance should be 0, because we want to make sure this is an even amount, not affected by any light. So we want to make sure that we have sort of a light source coming from where we're looking at it from above. I also want to turn off our use global light in case we decide to use that later, because we want to isolate this channel. And what I'm going to do is just increase our size, and then increase our choke. And you can see that we start to get these dark areas around the edges and a lot more depth in our image map. Of course, the more we increase our size, the more rounding we're going to get out of it. And I'm just going to decrease our opacity just a little so that it's not so black. But now we have a very good illusion, and it looks like a realistic branch. And one thing to keep in mind with this technique is some of our smaller branches. As you can see, most of our smaller branches have pretty much turned black. And so that really depends on, of course, these settings. And the smaller our branches, the more likely they're going to be entirely covered up by this inner shadow. So one thing we can do is adjust our contour. And that's going to give us a lot sharper of a line. So that way we can reduce our choke and our size and our opacity just a little to start to get some color back into those smaller branches, and so that it's not just black. And click OK. And we could also do other color editing if we wanted as well. If we needed to adjust the hue, we could pull up our hue and saturation, Control U on the keyboard, and pretty much specify which color we'd like, whether or not we want our saturation to be a little bit lower, if we'd like it a little more drab. In this case, I'm just going to bring our saturation down just a tiny little bit. And another thing to keep in mind too is, of course, what type of tree you're going to be working on. You want your bark textures to match up. So what I'm going to be doing is using the same bark texture on the trunk of the tree once we get into view. And that way everything's consistent and we don't have to worry about any jumps back and forth between different textures and the way it looks. But we also want to make sure too that we edit perhaps maybe that texture map outside the original, and that way we can match it to our color a little bit better. And one more thing we want to make sure we do before we go ahead and make any adjustments to moving this branch is we want to crop the edges. And I'm just going to zoom out a bit. And I'm just going to grab our crop tool and select in our gray area and drag it all the way to the other end of the gray area and hit enter. And the reason for that is we had that bark texture from before going outside of our lines. So if we were to move this material before we deleted and cropped, what would happen is we would see our texture start to move in our original texture and not just the part that's cut out. And that's because we use the magic wand tool just within this area. And what I want to do now is just move these two layers together. So just hold down Shift and select our branches and layer 1. And I'm just going to move this over and center it just a bit. And the reason why we want to grab both of them is in case you ever need to go back, then we still have our original branches layer that we created with this, so that way they're still lined up, because we might need to use this in the future, and we can of course use this still for our clip map. And what I'm going to do now is create a new layer group. So we just click on this little tab where we can create a new layer. We're going to select new group, and I'm just going to call this group old. And the reason for that is we're just going to grab all of our old materials that we're not using anymore and our old layers just into that so we can get them out of the way and just compress it. Now I'm also going to create a couple of more groups to help us for once we start editing our leaves and our clip maps. So I'm going to create a new group, and I'm going to call this top, and make sure our caps lock is off, top leaves. And the reason for this is we're creating two different sets of leaf layers, if not more when we have modified layers. We want to have a group of leaves on top of our surface so that we can have leaves going over our branches, and we also want to have one underneath it so that we can have leaves that are underneath our branches. And that gives us a little more variation and a little more realism. So we're going to create one more group, and I'm just going to call this one leaves, and that way we have our bottom leaves. And we want to make sure that our top leaves group is on top of our branches and our bottom one is below them. And now that we have our branches done, what we can do is start loading in our leaves and modifying exactly what we want to have for this tree. I've loaded in just a simple leaf that we have here, and this is actually from the Azulefex Leaves collection. And this is in the category of a weed, and it is a weed, but we can use, of course, any leaf that we want to make our tree. So we don't have to be constrained by what types of leaves to use. We can use whatever we want and create whatever type of tree we want out of that. If you want to be more specific about species, then you can find specific types of leaves for that, and of course how they're supposed to be grouped. But one thing we want to do is create a cluster. Now the Leaves collection does come in some clusters, but we're going to create a custom cluster just for this tree. And pretty much what that means is what we're going to be doing is taking this leaf, combining it, copying it a couple of times to make a couple sets of leaves, all within the same image map. want to do first is highlight all, and I'm going to copy. And that way when I go up to File New, we have that information of the amount of pixels that this image is within our new area. So we can see that we have to at least have 2,000 on our height, so I'm going to up this to 3,000. And our width, I want to also do 3,000. And click OK. Now, of course, we're not going to be using it at this size unless we want to have specific points where we zoom in. But the reason I want to work so largely is so that we don't have to downscale anything if we ever do need a high resolution map. That way we already have it created and we don't have to worry about making another one. In this case, most of these are going to be scaled down quite a bit, and we can zoom in here. You can see at 100% this is pretty much huge, and well, we don't need it that large. But we're still going to work with it at this level just to make our cluster, and then we can downsize it later. One thing we want to take a look at is in this case we have a little bit of dirt on the leaves, and we don't want to have all of our leaves like that. So what I'm going to do is just use our clone stamp tool and lower our hardness and just kind of clone some of these areas just to get rid of some of the dirt, and so it looks a little bit cleaner of a leaf. We can also grab our stem down here, and I'm using Alt and clicking to sample our area, and I'm just going to clean up around our stem. We can remove some of this dirt in here as well. And of course the level of detail you want is really dependent on personal preference, but that should be good right there. On this specific leaf, we have a very short stem on the bottom, and once we scale this down, that's going to be a problem because this might only be 1 pixel. So we need to make sure that we widen this area just a little, or we only use from this top part up and not use this base stem. But first we want to make sure we don't have any white outlines around this. And as you can see, I'm going to go ahead and change our background and just copy our background layer. And I'm going to use the paint bucket tool to turn that black, and that way we can see just the leaf, because we are going to need our leaves cut out with transparency, so we can see all this white area right now. We're going to use the magic wand tool and just delete that, and now we want to zoom in and make sure that there's no white edges left over. So we take a look around our surface, and we can see up here there's a little bit of a white area, so what we can do is just use the eraser tool and go around and remove some of those areas. Because we're also going to be using these leaf maps separately to create our clip and alpha maps. So we want to make sure that all this is taken care of before we start compiling our scene and putting these leaves together. So it doesn't look like we have any white outlines, so we should have a good transparency on there. And I'm going to turn off our background copy, which is our black layer, so we just have the white. And now let's edit this plant just a little. We'll take our leaf, I'm just going to center it, and I'm just going to make a quick copy and free transform it. And like I said, we don't want to go below that stem level, so we want to make sure we're connecting it at some of the lower parts, or some of the mid-range parts just above the stem. And I'm going to copy this again, and this time flip it horizontally when I free transform. And we also want to size it just a little bit differently so that it doesn't look like exactly the same leaf. And now the amount of leaves you make is really, of course, up to you. We're just going to have a couple in here. I'm going to add 2 smaller ones on the sides, and then we're also going to create a variation where we just have 3 leaves. So I'm just going to copy this other leaf once again, free transform it, and free transform again, and I'm just going to make it a little bit thinner and smaller. And then we can just move that in there. Maybe a little bit of rotation. And we'll do the same thing to the other one, just copy that, and we can flip that horizontally. to the other side. And we're just going to be removing all these extra stems and kind of cloning that together. And of course, depending on which leaf you're using, different shapes you'll have to create. And also, you can use multiple leaves together and not just the same type. So if we wanted to have a couple of different types of leaves on the same plant, we could do that as well. I'm going to keep this consistent, which is the same type of plant. What we could also do is maybe edit some of the edges on some of these leaves so they're not all exactly the same. And we can see this area too that's copied over. And that might get a little bit distracting. So we can remove that in some of our leaves, just a little, just to give that variation so it doesn't look like exactly the same leaf, because we don't want to have it look like it's just a bunch of copies. We also want to make sure we go back, and I'm going to need to delete that edge and make that nice and sharp again. And we'll just change it up a little tiny bit. And I'm not going to focus too much on the detail of that. But now what we want to do is just sort of remove those stems on the bottom. And we want to make sure that our middle leaf is on top, because we're going to blend those together. And then our small side leaves, I'm just going to drag those down all the way even lower, so they're just behind all of our other leaves. We'll select our first leaf, and I'm just going to use the eraser tool to delete that stem. And then I'm just going to do the same on our other leaves for the stems that are showing. We'll just remove that. And then these other ones we can remove as well. Now, whether or not you'd want to clone stamp this together is really your preference. Chances are you're not even really going to see it, so we could just leave it at that point without having to go in and blend those together. But if we did want to blend them, one really easy thing we could do is just highlight all of our leaf layers, and we're going to merge down so it's just on one layer. And then we can just use the clone stamp tool to sort of blend that together if we wanted to. And now I want to just create a little bit of color variation on this leaf. So once again, it doesn't just look like the same leaf pasted over and over. So what we can do is we're going to copy our layer. So we have two exact same layers of our leaves. And we're going to edit the hue and saturation on just one of our layers. So maybe we could drag this to more of a deeper green and desaturate that a little. And then what we can do is select our eraser tool. I'm going to bring that down to a hardness of 0. And we could just go in here and erase certain areas to get some coloration changes. And that way we could just turn that on and off if we wanted to. And then when it's done, we'll just select both of them and merge down. And now we have our leaf cluster that we can use for our tree. So we're going to drag this over to our branch, our current branches. And we can see that we're already in the leaves, in our bottom leaves, but we can also see that this leaf is huge. So we want to scale that down. But like I said, if we wanted to have a larger texture map, then we already have this created, and we don't have to worry about going back and doing that again. So if we wanted to have a larger branch layer, we could bring these in. Now the first thing I want to do is make sure I just scale this down to the largest leaves that are going to be on this branch. So we don't want to go too small because we don't want to have to scale upward, just downward. So we'll just make it about that size. And then we can start placing our leaves. So what we can do for this is just free transform to get it to match up to our branches. And then once we have it in place, we could just copy that leaf. Undo, make sure we just copy the layer. And then we can use that copy. We also want to make sure that we size it, make a little bit of a change so it doesn't look exactly the same. And we can just position that in a different area of our branch. And I'm just going to go ahead and place a lot of these bottom layer leaves, and then we can come back and start working on variations. Okay, now we have most of our basic underleaves created. And what I want to do now is actually create a simple variation on this. And what I'm going to be doing is just removing these bottom two leaves, so we just have the large three leaves. And I'm going to go back to our original layer, our original map. And first I'm actually going to just create a new group on top of our leaves. And we can call this leaves var for variation. And I'm just going to copy that or move that. And we can create a copy and move that down into leaves variation. And I'm just going to turn that layer on. And I also want to turn off just our bark in the background right now, and also all of our current leaves. And we can just edit this in here. I'm going to scale this down, just free transform it, make it a little bit smaller. And then I'm just going to use the eraser tool, make sure the hardness is at 100%, and just remove those smaller leaves on the bottom. Okay, so now we can just turn those back on. And we have our variation leaf now, our under variation leaf. We also want to copy this and drag this up into our top leaves just to have some variations up in there as well, and we'll create a top leaf variation group. Let's create a new group, top leaves and variation. And I'm just going to drag that into there for right now and turn that off. And we're going to go back to our underneath leaves, the ones that are not crossing over our branches. And we could just add some of these leaves in here. So add a little tiny bit of variation to the different areas. And put some bigger leaves in there. And then we could just copy that. And we'll do the same thing as we did before. We'll just place them in the positions around the different branches and start to make our tree come alive just a little bit more. So now our bottom layer is pretty much done, and we're just going to collapse these groups. And now we're going to take a look at our top leaves, which are the leaves that are going to be crossing over our branches. So we have a little bit of separation. So I'm just going to turn that layer on, our original leaf, and just scale that down to match with the rest of our stuff and the rest of our leaves. And then we can start to position these wherever we want them, so that we're just crossing over a couple of branches here and there, and we add just a little bit more realism. So we'll just copy that. We can free transform it and just add that to different areas. And really how many you make is up to you. I'm just going to add a couple in here. And then we can switch over to our variations for our top leaves, and that way we can have some of those variations on going over our branches, so it's not all exactly the same. And we just want to cover up that branch a little right there. Okay, and now we're going to switch to our top variation leaves. And I'm just going to scale these down, make a little bit smaller. And I'll just place some of these randomly around our branches and finish that part off. And now we have all of our leaves finished. If you want to add more, you can. Maybe you could make some smaller ones and put them in these little areas to fill it in. But we're going to just finish it up and start working on our maps for this. I'm just going to pull up our layers panel, and we can see how many layers of leaves we created for each of our groups. It's really quite a few, but it looks good overall. But we need to make just a couple of changes to that. The first thing I'm going to do is just combine all of our leaves on each of our groups. So we'll just select our top one and our bottom, and I'm just going to merge that down. And we're going to do the same thing with our other groups. Just merging those down so they're all just one individual set of leaves for each of our sections. And now what I also want to do is just combine our variations with our originals. So we'll combine our top variation, and then we'll combine our bottom variations with our regular ones. And then we can go ahead and just pull these out of these groups. And we can actually go ahead and just delete each one of these groups, because we're not going to need them anymore. And now we just have our two sets of leaves, our two layers of leaves, and our branch. And we're going to be using these now to create clip maps and specularity maps and transparency maps for our tree. But first I want to add a little bit of variation. So what I'm going to do is we're going to just turn off our leaves for right now, and I just want to have one layer on. We'll just turn our top layer on. And I'm going to create a copy of that, and then go back into our hue and saturation, and we can vary the color a little. Click OK, and then use the eraser like we did before, with a hardness of 0, and just start to pull some of the color out of these different leaves, and just a little more variation overall. And that way, once again, it doesn't look like it's all just the same leaf. And then what we're going to do is just merge those together. So it creates one color, or one layer for that. And we're going to do the same thing with our other layer. We're just going to copy that, and then pull up our hue and saturation using Control U, and we can change our color. Maybe we want it a little more green, and just really depending on what you want to do with it. Click OK, and we're going to just see a little tiny bit of difference. So maybe I'm going to change that a tiny bit more. And then use the eraser to remove some of the color from these certain leaves. And we can select those two layers, merge them together, and now we're back to having just our three main layers, and we have some nice variations in our color for these different leaves.